Before there were empires that stretched beyond the horizon, before the wars that would crack the earth and darken the sky, there was only sand. Endless, golden sand, drifting in slow waves beneath a sun that never seemed to set. The desert of Shurima was ancient even then, ancient beyond the memory of any living thing. And yet, somewhere within that vast and quiet emptiness, something extraordinary was waiting to be born. Close your eyes. Let your breathing slow. Feel the weight of the day leaving your shoulders, settling downward like sand through an hourglass. Tonight, we're going to travel together through one of the most haunting stories in all of Runeterra. A tale of gods who were made by human hands, of warriors who fought monsters and became something far worse, and of a corruption so deep that it swallowed the light of an entire civilization. This is the story of the Darkin, and it begins, as so many great tragedies do, with hope. Long before the fall, before the blood and the madness, Shurima was a golden land. Its name was spoken with reverence across the known world. Caravans from distant kingdoms would travel for months just to glimpse its shining cities, its towering monuments, its streets paved with white stone and lined with fountains that caught the sunlight like liquid diamonds. At the centre of it all stood the capital, a city so magnificent that travellers wept upon seeing it for the first time. They said it was not built by human hands alone, that the gods themselves must have guided the architects, because no mortal mind could conceive of such beauty. The heart of Shurima was its emperor. In those early days, the empire was ruled by a line of mortal men and women, wise and proud, who governed with firm hands and generous hearts. They built aqueducts that carried water across hundreds of miles of desert. They established universities where scholars studied the movements of the stars. They created laws that protected the weak and honoured the brave. And they believed, with every fibre of their being, that Shurima was eternal, that it would stand forever as a beacon of civilization in a dark and untamed world. But even in those golden days, there were whispers of something beneath the sand, something ancient and patient and hungry. The Shurimans had a word for it, though they rarely spoke it aloud. They called it the Void, and they believed it was the empty place from which all things had come, and to which all things would eventually return. It was not evil exactly, not in the way that a person can be evil. It was simply absence, a nothingness so profound that it could swallow light, swallow sound, swallow thought itself. And sometimes, in the deepest parts of the desert, where no one dared to travel, the sand would shift and something would reach up from below, testing the barrier between what is real and what is not. The rulers of Shurima knew they needed protectors. The world beyond the desert was wild and dangerous, filled with creatures and forces that no ordinary army could withstand. And so they turned to the sun disk, that great golden artifact that hung above the capital like a second sun. The sun disk was ancient, older perhaps than Shurima itself, and its origins were lost to time. Some believed it was a gift from the celestial powers above, a conduit for the very essence of the sun. Others thought it was a machine, built by a forgotten race of beings who understood the fabric of reality in ways that no modern scholar could comprehend. Whatever its true nature, the sun disk held a power that was beyond anything the mortal world had ever known. And so the Ascension began. It was the most sacred ritual in all of Shurima, a ceremony that drew pilgrims from every corner of the known world. When a mortal was chosen to undergo the ritual, they would climb the great staircase to the apex of the sun disk's pyramid. There, bathed in concentrated sunlight, their body would be remade. Flesh would become something stronger than steel. Bones would harden to the density of stone. The mind would expand, opening like a flower to the vast and terrifying light of cosmic understanding. They would become ascended, beings of immense power and towering stature, god warriors who could command the elements, shatter mountains with a single blow, and stand toe to toe with the forces of darkness that threatened Shurima from all sides. Imagine what that must have felt like, to be an ordinary person, a soldier or a scholar or a farmer's child, and then to be lifted up into blinding light and remade into something more than human. The pain must have been extraordinary, but so must the wonder. To feel your body changing, growing, becoming something vast and powerful. To feel your mind opening to truths that no mortal brain was ever meant to comprehend. To look down at the world from a height you had never imagined and realize that you could see everything, every grain of sand, every distant mountain, every star reflected in the surface of the sea. The Ascended were Shurima's greatest treasure. Each one was a living weapon, a protector, a symbol of the Empire's divine favour. They were given names that echoed through history, names that were spoken with awe and gratitude. They were the Golden Warriors, the Sun-Blessed, the chosen of the divine. And for a time they were exactly what Shurima needed them to be. Wise, powerful, compassionate. They defended the borders of the Empire against all threats. They crushed rebellions before they could begin. They kept the peace with a strength that was both terrifying and beautiful. Among the most powerful of the Ascended were those who would come to be known by many names over the centuries. There was Ta'anari, one of the first to be elevated, a warrior whose loyalty to Shurima was as unshakable as the mountains. There was Sebataru, whose wisdom was said to rival that of the greatest scholars. There was Enakai, fierce and proud, whose blade had never known defeat. And there were others, dozens of others, each one a masterwork of divine craftsmanship, each one a living testament to Shurima's power and glory. But among the Ascended, there were some whose hearts burned with a different fire. Not all who were chosen for the ritual were motivated by duty or love of empire. Some were driven by ambition, by a hunger for power that the Ascension only amplified. Some had been soldiers who loved the thrill of battle more than the peace that followed. Some had been rulers who craved dominion over others. And the Ascension, for all its glory, did not change what was in a person's heart. It only made it bigger. This is an important thing to understand, and it is one of the great tragedies of the Ascended. The ritual that created them was a gift, a transformation that elevated mortals to the level of gods. But it did not make them perfect. It did not erase their flaws or their fears or their darkest impulses. It only amplified everything they were, the good and the bad, the noble and the terrible. A kind person became a compassionate god. A proud person became an arrogant titan. And a person who harboured darkness in their heart became something very dangerous indeed. For a long time this did not matter. The Ascended were united by their shared purpose, by their love of Shurima, and by the watchful eye of the Emperor. They fought together, bled together, celebrated together. They were brothers and sisters in arms, bound by a bond that was deeper than blood. But as the centuries passed, as emperors rose and fell, and the world changed around them, cracks began to appear, small at first, almost invisible, like hairline fractures in a piece of beautiful pottery. But they were there, and they were growing. And then came the war that changed everything. The void had always been a distant threat, a shadow at the edge of perception, a whisper in the deep places of the earth. But in the land of Icathia, a once proud city-state that had been conquered and subjugated by Shurima, something terrible happened. The Icathians, bitter and desperate, made a choice that would haunt the world for millennia. They turned to the void. They reached into that nothingness and tried to harness its power as a weapon against their Shuriman oppressors. And the void answered. The story of what happened in Icathia is one of the darkest chapters in Runeterra's history. The details are lost to time, fragmented into shards of memory and legend, but the broad strokes are clear enough. The Icathians opened a rift, a tear in the fabric of reality itself, and through that rift poured the horrors of the void. Creatures that defied description, things that were not alive in any way that the mortal mind could understand. They moved through the streets of Icathia like a tide of living darkness, consuming everything in their path. Stone, metal, flesh, light, Everything was devoured, reduced to nothing, swallowed into the emptiness from which the void creatures had come. The Ascended were called to Icathia to fight, and they went, as they always did, with their golden armour gleaming and their weapons singing in the desert wind. They were the greatest warriors the world had ever known. They had never faced a challenge they could not overcome, but the void was different. The creatures that emerged from the rift were not like any enemy the Ascended had faced before. Some were vast and amorphous, like living pools of darkness that consumed everything they touched. Others were sharp and angular, their bodies made of crystalline structures that hummed with a frequency that set teeth on edge and made the mind reel. And some were simply incomprehensible, things that existed in shapes and dimensions that the mortal eye could not process, that the Ascended mind could barely contain. To look upon them was to feel your thoughts unravelling, your sense of self dissolving like salt in water. The void was not an enemy that could be defeated with strength alone. You see, the void did not only destroy bodies, it destroyed minds. It reached into the thoughts of those who fought against it and showed them things that no mortal or immortal consciousness was meant to see. It showed them the vastness of the nothingness, the infinite emptiness that existed beneath the surface of reality. It showed them how small they were, how fragile, how temporary. And for beings who had been elevated to the level of gods, who had been told that they were the greatest creations in the history of the world, this was a shattering revelation. Imagine being an Ascended, a being of immense power and cosmic awareness, and suddenly realizing that you are nothing, that your power is a candle flame in an infinite darkness, that the universe does not care about you, about Shurima, about anything at all, that beneath the thin veneer of reality there is only void, and it is patient, and it is hungry, and it will eventually consume everything. How would you carry that knowledge? How would you go on fighting, go on living, knowing that the darkness is always there, always waiting, always hungry? Some of the Ascended found a way. They buried the knowledge deep inside themselves, locked it away in the darkest corners of their minds, and carried on with their duty. They returned to Shurima and resumed their roles as protectors and guardians. But they were different now, quieter, more distant. Their eyes, once bright with the light of the sun, now held shadows that had not been there before. They smiled less, they fought more. They began to seek out conflict, not because it was necessary, but because it was the only thing that made them feel alive. And then Shurima fell. The details of the fall are a story for another time, but the broad strokes are these. The Emperor Azir attempted to undergo the Ascension Ritual, and it went catastrophically wrong. The sun disk's power was corrupted, the ritual failed, and the capital city was destroyed in a cataclysm that sent shockwaves across the desert. The Emperor was killed, the sun disk was damaged, and the Ascended, those golden god warriors who had been the pride of Shurima, were left without a purpose. For beings who had defined themselves by their service to the Empire, this was a devastation beyond words. Shurima was gone. The Emperor was dead. The cities were crumbling. The people were scattered, fleeing into the desert or the mountains or the jungles, seeking shelter from a world that suddenly seemed very hostile and very empty. And the Ascended, who had once been the pillars upon which the entire civilization rested, were left standing in the ruins, wondering what they were supposed to do now. Some tried to rebuild. They gathered the survivors and attempted to recreate what had been lost, to raise new cities from the rubble and establish new laws and traditions. But it was like trying to rebuild a sandcastle as the tide comes in. The spirit of Shurima, the thing that had made it more than just a collection of buildings and roads and people, was gone. The golden light that had infused every stone and every soul had dimmed, and no amount of effort could bring it back. The rebuilt settlements were hollow echoes of what had come before, and the Ascended who presided over them felt the emptiness like a physical pain, a cold weight in their chests where the warmth of purpose had once lived. This is where the story turns dark. This is where the Ascended begin to fall. Without the Empire to guide them, without the Emperor to give them purpose, the Ascended were forced to confront the truths they had been hiding from since Icathia. They were alone, they were immortal, they were impossibly powerful, and they were afraid. The knowledge of the void, that gnawing awareness of the nothingness that lay beneath everything, began to eat at them like acid. They could not sleep, because gods do not need sleep, but they could not find peace, because peace requires a mind that is at rest. They were trapped in their own consciousness, forever awake, forever aware, forever haunted by the darkness they had witnessed. And so they did what frightened, powerful beings have always done throughout history. They turned on each other. The wars of the Darkin, as they would come to be known, were among the most brutal and destructive conflicts in Runeterra's history. The Ascended, now calling themselves by the ancient Shuriman word for the fallen, split into factions and waged war across the continent. Each Darkin claimed dominion over a region, raising banners that bore strange and terrible sigils, symbols that had no meaning in any mortal language, but carried a weight of menace that could be felt even by those who could not read them. Each one believed that they alone had the answer to the emptiness, that they alone could fill the void with something, with anything, with blood and fire and conquest if nothing else. They raised armies of mortals, not because they needed them, but because having followers made them feel important, made them feel like they still mattered. They carved out territories and built fortresses and demanded worship from the people they had once sworn to protect. But the wars were not just about territory or power. They were about pain. The Darkin were suffering in ways that no mortal could truly understand. Their minds, expanded by the Ascension Ritual, were vast and complex, and the trauma of Icathia and the Fall of Shurima had left wounds that festered and grew. They were like open nerves, raw and exposed, and the only thing that dulled the pain was violence. The rush of battle, the heat of combat, the terrible satisfaction of destroying something, anything. These were the only things that could silence the screaming in their minds, if only for a moment. They began to change. The golden light that had once surrounded them dimmed, replaced by something darker, something red and pulsing. Their bodies, once magnificent and godlike, twisted and warped. Some grew extra limbs, others developed horns or claws or tails. Their voices deepened, becoming something harsh and terrible, like the grinding of stone against stone. And their eyes, those beautiful eyes that had once shone with the light of the sun, turned the colour of blood. The mortals who served them were the first to notice the change. The soldiers who had once followed the Darkin out of loyalty and devotion now followed them out of fear. The worship that the Darkin demanded became more desperate, more extreme. Temples were built, but they were not the shining white structures of old Shurima. They were dark places, red places, places where blood was spilled on stone altars, and the air was thick with the smell of iron and ash. The Darkin had become something that the people of Shurima had never imagined possible. They had become tyrants. They had become monsters. They had become the very thing they had once been created to destroy. The Darkin Wars raged for centuries. The details are lost, scattered across time like sand in a storm. But we know that the conflicts were devastating. Entire regions were laid waste. Cities that had survived the Fall of Shurima were destroyed in the crossfire. Populations were decimated, not just by the battles themselves, but by the Darkin's insatiable need for soldiers and servants and sacrifices. The land itself was scarred, marked by the passage of beings whose power was so great that their footsteps left craters and their voices shattered stone. And yet, for all their power, the Darkin were destroying themselves. Each war weakened them. Each battle left scars that did not heal. The corruption that had taken root in their minds was spreading through their bodies like a disease, and with each passing century, they became less like the Ascended they had once been, and more like something else entirely, something mindless, something cruel, something that existed only to destroy. It was during this long and terrible age that a new force entered the story. From the distant peak of Mount Targon, where the heavens touched the earth, and the stars spoke in whispers to those who could hear them, came the Targonians. They were not like the people of Shurima or Icathia or any of the mortal kingdoms. They were touched by the celestial, guided by powers that existed beyond the physical world, and they had been watching the Darkin with growing concern. The Targonians understood something that the Darkin themselves did not, that the corruption could not be defeated by force. You cannot kill a god warrior with a sword, not when their body can regenerate from almost any wound and their power can level mountains. The Darkin were too strong to be destroyed, and too far gone to be saved, but they could be contained. The Targonians devised a plan, elegant in its cruelty and profound in its consequences. They would not destroy the Darkin, they would imprison them, using knowledge drawn from the celestial realm, knowledge that was ancient when the world was young. They crafted weapons, not ordinary weapons, but vessels, containers, prisons made of metal and magic and starlight. Each weapon was designed to hold the essence of a single Darkin, to trap their consciousness within the blade, or the bow, or the staff, sealing them away from the world in a prison of their own making. The trap was sprung during the final great battle of the Darkin Wars. The details are murky, as all the best histories are when they involve the death of gods, but the essential truth is this. The Targonians, working with those ascended who had not yet fallen to corruption, confronted the Darkin in a battle that shook the foundations of the world, and one by one the Darkin were bound. Their physical forms were destroyed, their divine essence ripped from their bodies and sealed within the weapons that had been prepared for them. Imagine the moment of imprisonment, the shock, the rage, the disbelief. You're a god, a being of immense and terrible power, and suddenly you're trapped, not in a cage of iron or stone, but inside a weapon, inside a piece of metal that is cold and dark and silent. You can feel the world outside, you can sense the passage of time, but you cannot touch it, cannot affect it, cannot interact with it in any meaningful way. You scream, but no sound comes out. You rage, but nothing breaks. You beg, but no one hears. You are alone with your thoughts, your memories, your madness for eternity. For the Darkin, this was a punishment worse than death. Death would have been a release, an end to the suffering and the screaming and the endless hunger. But the weapons did not allow death. They preserved the Darkin's consciousness, keeping it alive and aware, frozen in a state of perpetual torment. The corruption that had consumed them did not fade. If anything, the isolation amplified it. Trapped within their prisons, with nothing to distract them from the horrors inside their own minds, the Darkin descended into a madness that was beyond anything they had experienced in the mortal world. Centuries passed, then millennia. The Darkin weapons were scattered across Runeterra, hidden in tombs and temples and buried deep beneath the earth. The world forgot about them, or rather, the world chose to forget. The stories of the Darkin became legends, and the legends became myths, and the myths faded into the kind of half-remembered tales that old women told children to keep them from wandering into the desert at night. But the Darkin did not forget. They could not. Their consciousness, trapped within the weapons, remained sharp and hungry and terrible. They dreamed, if you could call it dreaming, of escape. They whispered to anyone who came close enough to hear, offering power, offering knowledge, offering anything that might convince a mortal to pick up the weapon and release them from their prison. And sometimes mortals listened. The story of Varus is perhaps the most tragic example of what happens when a mortal encounters a Darkin weapon. Varus was once the name of a mortal, a loyal guardian of a temple in Ionia, a man who had dedicated his life to protecting a sacred wellspring. He was not a warrior, not in the traditional sense. He was a caretaker, a guardian, a man of peace. But when Noxian invaders threatened his homeland, he took up the weapon that had been sealed within his temple, not knowing what it was, not understanding what he was unleashing. The weapon was a bow, and within that bow was trapped the essence of a Darkin, a being of immense power and bottomless rage that had been imprisoned for thousands of years. When the mortal Varus grasped the bow, the Darkin's consciousness surged into him like a flood through a broken dam. It did not destroy him, not entirely. Instead, it merged with him, fusing his body and mind with the essence of an ancient and corrupted god. Two souls in one body, struggling for control, the mortal and the monster bound together in a prison of flesh and bone. The being that emerged from that fusion was neither the Guardian nor the Darkin, but something new and terrible. It took the name Varus, wearing it like a mask, and walked out into the world with a bow that sang with dark power and a heart that was torn between two very different kinds of hunger. The mortal part of Varus yearned for peace, for home, for the simple life he had lost. The Darkin part yearned for destruction, for conquest, for the restoration of a glory that had died before the mortal was born. And the two were locked in an eternal struggle, each trying to dominate the other, each unable to fully succeed. This is the tragedy of the Darkin in its most intimate form. Not the grand wars or the fall of empires, but the quiet, desperate struggle of two beings trapped in a single body, each one a prisoner of the other. The mortal who did not ask for this burden, the god who did not choose this prison, both of them victims of a cycle of violence and corruption that began thousands of years ago and shows no sign of ending. And then there is Kayn. Kayn is a different story, a different kind of tragedy. He was not a peaceful guardian who was corrupted against his will. He was a child soldier raised in the shadow of Noxian invasion, hardened by violence from his earliest years. He was found by the Order of Shadow, a secretive group of Ionian assassins, and trained to be a weapon, a living blade in service to their cause. He was talented, perhaps the most talented student the Order had ever seen, and he was given a weapon that was unlike any other. The weapon was a scythe, and within that scythe was trapped the Darkin known as Rhaast. Rhaast was one of the most powerful of the imprisoned Darkin, a warrior whose thirst for blood and destruction was legendary even among his own kind. When Kayn took up the scythe, Rhaast began his assault immediately, whispering promises of power, offering visions of conquest, trying to overwhelm the young assassin's will and seize control of his body. But Kayn was not like Varus. He was not a peaceful man who had been caught off guard. He was a weapon himself, forged in the same fires of violence and loss that had created the Darkin. And he did not submit, he did not surrender. Instead he fought back, engaging Rhaast in a battle of wills that is as fascinating as it is terrifying. Two warriors, one mortal and one divine, each trying to dominate the other, each refusing to yield. The struggle between Kayn and Rhaast is ongoing, a war fought not on any battlefield, but within the confines of a single mind. Some days Kayn is dominant, and the scythe is a tool, an extension of his will, a weapon that serves him rather than the other way around. On those days, Kayn is cold and efficient, a shadow assassin who moves through the world with lethal grace. But other days, Rhaast rises, and the scythe pulses with a dark and terrible power that threatens to consume everything in its path. On those days, Kayn's eyes flicker with a red light, and his voice takes on a deeper, more resonant quality, and those who know him best can see the struggle playing out behind his gaze. The outcome of this struggle is uncertain. It is possible that Kayn will eventually triumph, that his will is strong enough to contain the Darkin forever, using Rhaast's power without being consumed by it. It is also possible that Rhaast will eventually prevail, that the ancient and terrible consciousness of the Darkin will overwhelm the mortal mind and emerge once more into the world, free and furious and hungry for the destruction that has been denied to him for thousands of years. And there is a third possibility, Perhaps the most frightening of all, that neither will win, that they will remain locked together forever. Two minds in one body, each one a prisoner of the other, for all eternity. These are the echoes of the Darkin Wars, rippling through time like waves from a stone thrown into still water. The great conflict ended thousands of years ago, when the Targonians bound the Darkin in their weapons, but the consequences are still being felt. Every time a mortal picks up a Darkin weapon, every time the whispers of an imprisoned god reach the ears of someone desperate or foolish enough to listen, the cycle begins again. The corruption spreads, the struggle for control begins, and the world is reminded in small and terrible ways that the Darkin are not gone. They are merely waiting. Think about that for a moment. Right now, as you lie here, as the night wraps itself around you like a blanket, there are weapons hidden in the dark places of the world, tombs and temples and deep forgotten vaults, sealed away behind walls of stone and magic. And within those weapons, consciousness stirs. Minds that were once mortal, then divine, then corrupted, now trapped and dreaming. Dreaming of escape, dreaming of the world they once knew, dreaming of blood and fire and the sweet, terrible rush of power. The Darkin are patient. They have been imprisoned for thousands of years, and they can wait a few thousand more. They are not going anywhere. They are always there, in the dark, whispering, waiting for someone to hear them. And sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, when the world is still and the mind is vulnerable, you can almost feel them. A distant hum, like the vibration of a blade being drawn across stone. A whisper at the edge of hearing, too faint to make out but too insistent to ignore. A presence, ancient and terrible and impossibly lonely, reaching out from the darkness and asking to be remembered. But there is something beautiful in this story too, if you look carefully. Something quiet and small and easy to miss, but real nonetheless. It is the fact that the Darkin were not always monsters. They were once people, ordinary people, who were given extraordinary gifts and asked to bear the weight of a world on their shoulders. They fought bravely. They suffered greatly. They were broken by forces that no one, mortal or divine, could have been expected to withstand. And even now, even after thousands of years of imprisonment and madness and corruption, there is something left of who they once were. A fragment, a memory, a flicker of the golden light that once surrounded them. Varus, the mortal guardian who was merged with a Darkin, still remembers his home. He still yearns for the simple life he lost, for the peace and the quiet and the sound of water flowing over stone. The Darkin within him tries to drown out those memories with visions of blood and destruction, but they persist, stubborn and beautiful, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of unimaginable darkness. And Kayn, the shadow assassin who wields a Darkin scythe, still fights for something. He fights for survival, for mastery, for the right to determine his own fate. He may not be a hero in the traditional sense, but there is something heroic in his refusal to submit, in his insistence on being the one who holds the weapon rather than the one who is held by it. These small victories, these tiny acts of resistance, may not be enough to redeem the Darkin or undo the damage that has been done. But they matter. They remind us that even in the darkest stories, even in the most terrible tragedies, there is always a spark of light, always a reason to hope, always something worth fighting for. And so the Darkin sleep, and the world turns, and the weapons lie in their hidden places, dreaming their terrible dreams. The corruption that consumed them has not faded, and the hunger that drives them has not diminished. They are as dangerous now as they ever were, perhaps more so, because the long centuries of imprisonment have only sharpened their rage and deepened their despair. But they are contained, held in check by the magic of the Targonians and the stubborn refusal of mortals like Kayn to be consumed. Some say that the Darkin were once seen as saviours, that in the earliest days of their ascension, people would fall to their knees and weep with gratitude at the sight of them. They were proof that the heavens cared, that the sun watched over its children, that the darkness could be held at bay. And perhaps that is the cruelest part of the story, that the very beings who were meant to save the world became the ones who nearly destroyed it, that the light itself could be corrupted, that even gods can fall. Whether this peace, if you can call it peace, will last is another question entirely. The Darkin are patient, and they are clever, and they have had thousands of years to plan their escape. Some say it is only a matter of time before they break free, before the weapons crack and the darkness spills out, and the world is forced to face the consequences of an ancient crime that was committed long before anyone alive today was born. Others say that the containment will hold, that the Targonian magic is strong enough to endure, that the Darkin will remain imprisoned for all eternity. But perhaps the real question is not whether the Darkin will escape, but whether we, as a world, have learned anything from their story. They were created to protect, and they became destroyers. They were given power to serve, and they used it to dominate. They were elevated to the level of gods, and they fell to the level of monsters. And all of it, every step of the long and terrible journey, began with a single, simple human flaw: the inability to face the darkness within. The void showed them the emptiness at the heart of reality, and instead of accepting it, instead of finding peace with the knowledge that the universe is vast and indifferent and beautiful in its indifference, they tried to fill it. They tried to fill the void with power, with violence, with control, and the more they tried to fill it, the bigger it grew until it consumed them entirely. This is the lesson of the Darkin, if there is one, that the darkness cannot be fought with darkness, that the void cannot be filled with violence. That power, no matter how great, cannot protect you from the emptiness inside. The only thing that can do that is acceptance, the quiet, difficult, courageous act of looking at the darkness and saying, "I see you, I know you are there, and I am not afraid." Whether the Darkin will ever learn that lesson is a question that only time can answer. For now, they sleep in their weapons, dreaming their terrible dreams, waiting for the day when they will once again walk the earth, and the world turns and the stars shine, and the desert of Shurima stretches on forever, golden and silent and patient, holding its secrets close. Let the darkness settle around you now. Let the weight of these ancient stories ease from your shoulders like sand flowing through an hourglass. The Darkin sleep, and so too can you. There is nothing in the dark that was not there in the light. The weapons lie quiet, the whispers fade, and the night, vast and gentle and full of stars, wraps itself around the world like a lullaby sung by someone who has loved you since before you were born. Rest now. The story will be here when you wake, and somewhere, deep in a hidden tomb beneath long-forgotten ruins, a weaponaire hums softly in the darkness, dreaming of a golden age that was, and a future that has not yet been written. Sleep well. The night is long, and kind, and full of quiet wonders. Let it carry you somewhere peaceful. Let it carry you home,